Okay, we're going to look at some basic classifications. So there are actually many different models of classification that people in type or designers reference. These are two of those classification systems. On the left is Robert Bringhurst, and on the right is Catherine Dixon. The fact that these are so different is going to give you hopefully some insight into the lack of universality that we're dealing with. Bringhurst's approach is more about developing a canon. So he's looking a lot at history and art history and literature and so on to develop a way of talking about type as a canon, whereas Catherine Dixon is more interested in creating a very comprehensive system that looks at form and history, as well as sort of previously developed classification systems. Both of these are from prior to the turn of the millennium. I'm not going to be sticking to either one of them, but I'm going to borrow from both of them. And the reason why we don't have like a specific universal set of terminology that you can just memorize is partly because type keeps changing, but also language is different from place to place. And the other thing is that there's this kind of odd situation in type and print, which is that a lot of the information and terms that we have are held orally and not printed. And so for that reason, actually, it's very difficult to Google type. You can Google type and you'll find facts. Some of the facts are wrong, but it doesn't really work that well because it's not, in order to be able to talk about type, you need to be successfully observing it. And so the bad part about that, or the part that can be sort of anxiety producing, especially for people who are new to type or maybe who are not from a design background, but they're a writer or an artist or somebody who works with letter forms and they want to be able to talk about them. The nerve-wracking thing about that is that it just can feel like this big sea. How do you even know how to get in? You've made a mistake. You don't know what your mistake was. The good news about it is that once you've begun to learn how to observe, you can keep on with that. And your observation, your ability to observe is never going to disappear. Whereas terms might change or you might forget them. They can, in their own way, be actually less precise. And so for that reason, I think it's actually really valuable to develop a practice of observing, and you really don't need that many words to help you along there. Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about how to take an observing approach to type. So one way that you could break down type that's very simple is between lowercase and uppercase. So at the bottom, what you see is Garamond. It's a really classic Roman. It's an early Roman typeface. And above it is the scribal tradition that it's connected to, the Carolingian minuscule, that has partially a French heritage to it, as well as what we would now refer to as Germany and Rome as well. And here we see the uppercase. I should mention here, because anybody who knows about type might be feeling uncomfortable with the kerning here. I'm sorry, it's not award-winning. But here we have uppercase, and uppercase type is related to the Trajan columns that has a Roman tradition to it. And I think it's worth noting here that the Trajan columns here are carved, and so as well as having that scribal tradition that we looked at with the lowercase, we also have a carving tradition that's part of type, and that's important because one of the things we look at is tool or reference to tool. So here we have a digital version of Trajan, and I'm just going to draw your attention to the leg of this R here, which is very straight and sticks out at an angle. So Inga Drukri talks about the structure of Roman capital letters in this really wonderful way. And one of the things I like about the way that she approaches it is that she reminds you about the form that you're looking at. It's so easy to take the form for granted because we use letters to communicate language. And so if you look at an H, for example, it's very easy to sort of see right through the form to the phonic underneath, which is actually what you want. Ideally, that's how type should be functioning. But we're trying to disrupt that connection so that we can look at the form. And so she breaks it down and points out how geometric Roman type is. And also talks about the rhythm that is established by type. So not all letter forms have like a great rhythm between them. So if you look at, for example, this V and R and H, it's not the most rhythmic combination of elements. But if you look at the S and the O, the idea of that this is two small half circles and these are two large half circles, you can see the way that the forms echo one another and how rhythms can be established. And the other aspect of type, of course, is that as you're going from page to page, there are also rhythms in play. So rhythm is a really key part of appreciating type. I think that the concept of broad categories making organizing easier and more accurate really is helpful in the case of type. And so what we can do is kind of just keep taking steps out until you reach the point at which your eyes are no longer able to help you navigate. And then if you stop being able to see the difference between things, that's fine. Just take a step backwards and use the classification, the most recent classification that you feel confident using. So 3 ways that you could break up Western European orthographies might be black letter, Roman, and italic. These are very easy to see the differences between them. They have different traditions attached to them. All 3 of them have a scribal tradition attached to them. Now the Roman and italic here, I'm just going to draw your attention to how the letter forms change in the italic. There are some really significant changes between the letter forms. So hold on to that for a moment. Another way to break down type could be between serif and sans serif. Many people nowadays are familiar with serifs, partly because we work with type. The average person has access to type in a way they didn't 20 or 30 years ago. So serifs are these little, you could just call them pokey-outy things. These are little serifs here. And this typeface doesn't have serifs, so it's without serifs, and it's a sans serif. If we were to take a look at the italics of these, you'll see that there is a difference that's showing up. As with the hamburger, you'll see that these letters are really quite radically changing from the Roman to the italic, whereas in the sans serif, that change is not so evident. This K does not change in the same way the K in the Garamond does. And the reason, or what you're seeing here is you're seeing a true italic and an oblique. So the reason for this difference is that italics were originally their own tradition. So early on in printing, you would print a book in an italic face or in a Roman face. It was a choice. As our orthography progressed, an italic became essentially a subsidiary of a Roman, and you use it for emphasis or grammar or what have you. And so it gets pulled into a larger family. In some respects, actually, you could connect that to a tradition of homogenization that print tends to encourage. But at any rate, it comes from a separate tradition. And so in many modern serif faces that you're looking at, what's actually the origin of what you're looking at is that a contemporary type designer is referencing a Roman, like an older specimen of a Roman face, and then has found a specimen from a totally different font and adapted that to be the italic of the Roman, and will adjust the proportion and the weight and so on to make them fit together. But they come from different traditions, and when that tradition is still visible, it's a true italic. In the case of a sans serif like this, it's very common that rather than being an italic, you'll find that it is actually just more or less sloped, and so it's an oblique. I feel like I should mention here that if you are a design student especially, please don't artificially tilt letters on a Roman face to create an oblique. This is designed by the type designer. What you don't want to do is use like a rotation to tilt it over. That's called bastardization, and it's illegal. So at any rate, to recap here, we have a serif, we have serif, the sans serif, and we have a true italic and an oblique. Another way to break this down is display versus text. So on the left here, you see a very evident display face. You wouldn't be able to comfortably read a paragraph of type set in this. This is really just for emphasis or for an aesthetic quality. And on the right, you see Didone and a text weight, and this would be fine to set a paragraph of type in. You could read it comfortably. Where maybe it becomes slightly more complicated is that there are cases in which you might have a weight of a Didone or a style of a Didone that is for display and another that is for text. So for example, here we've retained the same text weight Didone, which is in a Roman. And so if you see the words Roman or text, that's what you're being informed about. And on the left, we see two display variations of Didone. The clue is in the name poster or in 72. 72 refers to the size at which this was designed to be set at, 72 points, really big. So sometimes this does confuse people, and I will receive paragraphs set in Didone 72, I think partly because just the name has confused the person, but also maybe because, it's an attractive face, it's an interesting face, and so it might be appealing to work with. But you don't want to set up a paragraph of type in it. It would not be comfortable to read. So that would be display versus text. We can apply some basic terminology at this point. So we have here two fonts. They're both Roman serif text. If you take a look at them, you'll begin to notice some differences between them, and we'll go over some of those. But essentially, this is from an earlier period, and this is from a later period of type. There is a classification that sits in between these two, which is more difficult to recognize. And if you're a little bit more advanced at type and you're curious about what that might be, that would be a transitional face like Caslon. But what we have on the left here is a Garamond, and on the right we have a Didone. And so because they are quite different from one another, I think these make good samples. Okay, so if we were to examine these, there are a few tools that we could use. One is we could look at terminals, we could look at contrast, we could look at axis, and we could look at modulation. And what we find out about those will give us information about the font, even if we don't know what font it is. So let's start with the terminals. This terminal here is very abrupt. It's got a calligraphic quality. This would refer to a tool. It could refer to a pen and the way that a pen is calligraphic and ends abruptly. It's also connected to a tradition of carving. When people would make a letter form like this, they would be carving it out. And if you think about how small type is when it's set in, for example, like a book or long form text, you would be very difficult to carve out something as detailed as this. So that gives us some information about the font. This A here, the terminal ends in what's called a ball terminal, but you could also just notice that call it a rounded terminal. And this is from a time period in which people were beginning to sketch out in advance what designs that they wanted to achieve, and then have those designs executed in another stage, which is actually more of a design process. So that would be the terminal. The contrast has to do with the fact that some of the areas are very thin and some are very thick. And you can see in the Didone that the thin areas are significantly thinner and the thick areas are significantly thicker. The contrast between those is very evident. So we would say it's a high contrast. This in comparison has a much lower contrast. You could also describe this as having a vertical stress, but let's stick with the high contrast. The axis you can find by lining up the thinner parts of a letter like an O. The reason why you have some thicker areas and some thinner areas, it's making reference to the way that a person writes. When you use a pen, not if you use like a ballpoint pen, but if you use, for example, a fountain pen or something more calligraphic, as you press down, part of the stroke will be thicker than others, right? And so the thin areas here reference the way in which a right-handed person writes and the angle at which they write. And it leaves behind this axis, which is referred to as a humanist axis because of that reference to the hand. The Didone here, in in comparison, has the thin areas stacked up right on top of each other. And so it's perfectly upright. This is no longer wishing to make reference to a human hand. Instead, it's making reference to the machine that houses the type. It's much more mechanical, and it is referred to often as a rationalist axis. So those are more granular terms. You could pull back from them and just say, well, this is a high contrast face, or it's much more abstracted from the human hand. This is more of a calligraphic quality. These are different ways that you could talk about these fonts. Modulation, I believe I just explained what that was, right? That's the way that the stroke becomes thinner and thicker. So it's modulated. Okay, so we're gonna leave Garamond behind at this point, and we're gonna dive deeper into Didone, or a font like Didone. So here are two fonts that have quite similar qualities to them. Based on what we've discussed so far, we could say that there are Roman, serif, text, and we could add high contrast to this. We could also talk about the axis as a rationalist axis, but let's keep it relatively simple and say these four. So these are two different fonts, one classic French and one a classic Italian font, but they belong to the same classification. You can see how similar they are. There are two main terms that you would use to describe the classification that they belong to. One would be a Didone, which comes from their names, and that's very commonly used, and the other is modern, which refers to the break from the human hand that we just talked about. So modern is also a great term. It's the one that I very commonly use. The benefit of Didone is it's so specific, it's not going to mix the person up. So if you're describing verbally a modern font, somebody might be thinking of like Futura or sans serif or something. So Didone is a little bit more specific, but modern is accurate. And in Catherine Dixon's model, you'll notice that the Didone, which is here, falls under a serif category, and then it has a subcategory. But of course, as we discussed, there are Didone variations that are a display. And so that complexity, that difficulty of making all the pieces of the puzzle fit perfectly together is actually why we have so many, or one of the reasons why we have so many classification systems. So I'm going to leave Didone behind now and stick with our other Didone, Dido. These are some samples of the design process. These are called smoke proofs, and they've got little notes on them from the designer. I love Dido. I love this beautiful leg of the R, which is different than the Trajan one. So this bend in the leg of the R is something that comes along with the modern style. So this is the design of the font, this is the design of the letter, which would be referred to as a typeface, and these are proofs of that typeface. That's the design. The font is the usable version of that typeface. You could have a digital or a metal font, for example. These are all digital, and these are different foundries that have their versions of a Dido. So the Dido part remains consistent, and this part changes. And so that's a difference between a typeface and a font. I'm going to use the masthead of Vogue as a sample here. So just take a quick look at Vogue. This is the nameplate. Now, you'll remember from what we've said already that this you could describe this as uppercase, and also you could say it's a Didone or it's a modern face. That would be accurate. I have put some other Didone around it. Now, Vogue has caused some confusion in my classroom. There was a period of time where students were being asked to find a sample of a Didone, and I was handed in Vogue pretty regularly. And it turned out that's partly because there were some websites that identified it as a Didone. There is actually a clue in one of the letter forms that makes it really evident whether or not it comes from a Dido or a Didone. And you can pause that if you want to figure that out on your own. But it has to do with this little spur, this downward pointing spur at the foot of the G. This, by the way, is the chin. I think it's cute that uppercase G's have a chin. But anyway, so this little spur here, that's your clue. So you'll notice that the Didone does not have that. So nobody would fault you for if you glanced at this and you said, "Oh, is that a Bidone?" No one would say, "Oh, you're ridiculous." They would actually mean that you had a pretty good eye to say that. But technically, what this is a Dido, and the reason that it doesn't connect perfectly to any of these is that it's a custom variation, and this is really common with brands. If there's ever a brand that you enjoy the way that the font looks and you're trying to find it, it's possible that they have a custom variation that's not actually available to you. So the information that you have so far is that this is uppercase and it's a Didone, and now you know that it's a custom Dido. The other thing that you might be noticing is that the proportion is a little bit different than these other ones, and also that the spacing is a little bit. So this is tightly spaced, right? There are ways to talk about that a typographer might use. They might talk about like negative tracking or, tight tracking. But I think it's fine to just say it's tightly spaced. It's clear and everybody will understand what you mean. And then this is just a slightly more compressed compressed proportion than these ones. That's pretty close, actually, to this. CBS, along with Zara and many other companies, have a custom variation of Dido of their own, which makes sense because it's great. Okay, so I'm going to talk about sans serifs for a second. I think that all people involved with type have pet peeves. I try to keep mine to a minimum, and I try to be respectful of the fact that other people don't necessarily care. I don't correct people unless they ask me to, or if they're a student. But one of mine is when people use the word Helvetica to say sans serif. Helvetica is a specific font. It doesn't mean sans serif. I've tried to figure out when I hear this happen if the person thinks that all sans serifs look the same, and so they assume it's kind of like saying Kleenex instead of tissue or something, like a brand, or if it just sounds a little bit fancier. I wonder if it's that. So my plea to you is to not do that. So I'm going to take a look at Futura and Helvetica, and this is inspired by the first class that I ever taught. There was a student who was having a very difficult time seeing the difference between Futura and Helvetica, and they told me this secretly, which is very common that people will confide to me that they can't see something or they don't know something. And of course, I kept the student anonymous, but I put it to the class, and of course it turned out that most of the class could also not see the difference at all. So we talked a little bit about, how to navigate that. So here we see Futura and Helvetica on top of one another. If you're a fan of Supreme or Barbara Kruger, you're going to be able to tell right away which one it is. But again, as with the Vogue situation, I wouldn't fault anybody who accidentally thought this was a Helvetica. These are two sort of later 20th century advertisements that have that quality that both of these fonts lend, especially when Futura is uppercase, that have that kind of authoritative, multinational look to them. And of course, both these fonts have their roots in the avant-garde, and that's the way it goes, right? Okay, so this is the last slide I have. Let's take a look at Futura and Helvetica in detail and come up with a few pieces of terminology you can use to talk about those. So first of all, especially if you're a student and if you're having trouble, one thing that you can do is actually lay two fonts on top of each other in a program like InDesign or Illustrator, turn the opacity down, and just take a look at what jumps out to you as a difference. I've done that here so that the red is a Helvetica. So there are going to be a few things that jump out at you right away. Probably one of the first ones you'll notice is the difference in the two A's. They come from two traditions. They both function as an A, right? This could be referred to as a double-story A and a single-story A. This could also be an infant character. This would be another way to describe that. And of course, the G in both of them is an infant character or a single-story G, so it's mixed in the case of Helvetica. So that's one thing that you might notice. And in general, Futura has this rounder quality to it. You can see it in the dot of the I and so on. You could describe that as being geometric. If you were just if you weren't sure if it was Futura and you said it was a geometric sans serif, that would communicate what you're looking at. Helvetica does not have that same geometric quality. And the fact that it has an infant character, which is easier for new readers, and the fact that it's so round, gives it a friendlier quality than Helvetica. Helvetica looks a little bit more serious. So if I had to pick between these two typeset something for kids, I probably would use the Futura. Let's talk about a couple of other differences that we see here. One is the leg of the R. So if you remember, the Trajan had that straight leg, and the modern font, the Didone that we looked at, that ushered in this change in the R where it sort of hangs down and is more bent. And so this actually refers to that modern tradition. It's connecting itself to that modern tradition. So there's a meaning to it. But of course this one doesn't, and they both serve a similar function of feeling more contemporary. Of course, they're both actually quite old. This is from the 1920s, this is from the 1950s. There's only one other thing I wanted to mention here, which is the height here of this L. So Futura has higher ascenders and in some cases lower descenders. You can see the G hangs down lower. And what that does is it gives the words a little bit more shape. And so I think it's actually, I believe, and this other people feel the same way, that if you were to typeset a paragraph in Futura, it's actually pretty comfortable to read, more comfortable than Helvetica in a print situation. So, for example, if I only had these two fonts and I needed to typeset a novel, it would be unusual to typeset a novel in a sans serif. But if I had to, for some weird reason, it's the end of the world and I only have two fonts, I would probably choose the Futura. These low descenders and high ascenders can make for some issues with leading, but I just think it's a little bit more comfortable to read because of the word shape. Another designer could be free to disagree, but they don't have this microphone, so I can rule the land on this. Okay, I'm getting punchy. Okay, so I think we're at the end. This is really everything I wanted to cover. So just to sort of summarize briefly here, these are both sans serifs. You could call this a geometric sans serif. If you're curious, this would be a neo-grotesque, but you can just call it a sans serif. That's fine. And we talked about the single story A and the double story A, and the single story G for both of them. So I think we covered a lot of ground, and hopefully you feel a little bit more confident talking about type and describing what you see. Okay, thanks for your attention today.